For our final lesson in trigonometry, we are going to take a look at the graphs of a sine and cosine wave. This is basically when we take the values of x when we have an equation in the form of y equals a times sine of bx, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a little bit, but we basically would plot points with an x and then what the corresponding y is. Now keep in mind that on this xy coordinate plane, the x-axis is written in terms of radian measures. So if you were trying to do this on your calculator, if your calculator was in degree measure, you would not get the same points as what you see on these graphs. Now, what I'm hoping is that you recognize some common features about each of these graphs and are able to graph them or at least sketch them without having to get the specific details for every single little point. So let's take a look at a couple of these things, and we're only going to focus on sine and cosine, and a lot of times we call them the sine curve or the sine wave. What this does is it gives us kind of this oscillating frequency looking type of curve, and what we'll do is I'll post a little animation online and you can kind of see how that evolves from the unit circle. So a couple things that you want to pay attention to here, and I'll try to get both the cosine and the sine graph in the same picture. What we'll do here is take a look at both of these equations and both of these graphs at the same time. Now, what you'll see is that on y equals sine of x, which is the first graph, and then y equals the cosine of x, which is the second graph, you can see a couple different things. First of all, the wave looks almost identical. Now, what you'll hopefully come to realize is a couple points about it. First of all, the sine graph starts at 0, 0. Whereas the cosine graph starts at 0, 1. So that's the first major difference between the two graphs. Now, if that's all we're doing, if we're just graphing the basic sine and the basic cosine graph, that's really the main difference. Now, there's two parts of this graph that I'm going to want you to know, and it's called the period and the amplitude, and I'm going to discuss each of those. You can see just from the graph itself and through the demonstration here that the amplitude is really being represented by the height of the graph off of the x-axis. So you can see that just in a general sine curve or general cosine curve, the amplitude is equal to 1. What the period is the length on the x-axis that it takes to complete one cycle. And so what we mean by one cycle is it goes up, down, and back up, and gets back to the x-axis to start that up again over the course of 2 pi. And you can see, if you recall, 2 pi is actually how many radians it is around for a full circle. So if we took the unit circle and put our point at 0, 0 and we started rolling this thing around, that point would more or less make this curve. And so we call that cycle a period. And now that period can change and the amplitude can change as well. So for a cosine graph, it's the same thing except for the fact that you're starting at 0, 1 instead of 0, 0. So keep that in mind. If we're talking about domain and range, if we have an amplitude of 1, then the range is from positive 1 to negative 1, all the y values. And the domain is all the x values, so it would be all real numbers. So those are some basic visual characteristics that you can see in regards to the actual sine and cosine graphs. Now, we'll come back in the next video and we'll talk about some more of the mathematical details and actually work our way through a couple examples.